Santa Monica, California. September 1949. A folding chair scrapes against linoleum in a community college auditorium that smells like floor wax and old velvet curtains. Afternoon light slants through high windows, catching dust in the air. A young man in a white t-shirt sits in the third row, shoulders hunched forward, hands loose between his knees. He's watching a dozen students stumble through monologues, Shakespeare they don't understand, Tennessee Williams they're too young to sell. The drama teacher doesn't look up from her clipboard when she calls out, "You in the back, show us what you've got, kid." Her name is Jean Nelson Owen. She's in her mid-40s, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She's seen hundreds of students in this room. She has no idea who she's about to see. The kid stands up. And in 8 minutes, everything she thought she knew about talent begins to crack. This is not the story of James Dean on a movie set. It's not about Rebel Without a Cause, not East of Eden, not the red jacket or the Porsche or the legend that built itself around a life that ended at 24. This is about a moment that happened years earlier, in a place no one was watching, when a 19-year-old transfer student with no credits and no connections walked into a beginning acting class at Santa Monica City College and sat down in the back row like he was trying not to take up space. His name wasn't on the roster. He hadn't registered yet. He was just auditing, quietly, almost apologetically, trying to figure out if this thing he felt inside him, this need to perform, had a name. Jean Owen taught 5 sections a week. Most of her students wanted easy units or thought theater might help them meet people. She knew the difference between someone who loved attention and someone who needed to communicate. She'd been a Broadway understudy before a knee injury ended her stage career and sent her west. She was good at spotting talent. She was better at spotting pretension. When she looked at the quiet kid in the third row, thin, pale, restless, she didn't see anything special yet. Just another California boy who probably wanted to be discovered. She had no reason to think he was different. He looked like half the young men who drifted through her classes, aimless, hungry, unfinished. But what happened in the next 8 minutes changed her understanding of what talent actually looked like. And perhaps that's where this story truly begins. The room was not impressive. Scuffed stage, mismatched folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, overhead fluorescents that flickered every few seconds, a piano shoved against the back wall out of tune, dark curtains that had been red once maybe, but had faded into something closer to rust. Jean Owen had been teaching in this space since 1945. She'd worked with returning GIs who couldn't sit still, studio hopefuls who thought charm was the same as skill, and DeMille extras trying to prove they were more than background. Her rule was simple. If you couldn't hold the attention of a room full of distracted college kids, you couldn't hold a theater. That afternoon, the students were doing what students always did. Safe choices, obvious pieces, melodrama they didn't have the life experience to understand yet. One girl performed Blanche Du Bois and made it sound like a soap commercial. A boy in suspenders tried Hamlet and forgot his lines halfway through. Jean made notes, gave corrections, kept her face neutral. Then she looked up and noticed the kid in the back hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He wasn't reading, wasn't talking to anyone, just watching, absorbing. His eyes tracked each performer with an intensity that felt almost invasive. She didn't like people who just watched. "You in the back," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "You've been sitting there long enough. Show us what you've got, kid." He blinked, looked around as if she might be talking to someone else. "Yeah, you," Jean said. "Come on, let's see it." He stood slowly, walked to the front of the room with his hands in his pockets. No script, no introduction. He didn't announce what he was performing or who wrote it. He just started. And within 30 seconds, Jean realized she had no idea what she was watching. It wasn't a famous monologue, it wasn't classical, it wasn't even theatrical in the way she'd been trained to recognize. It was internal, modern, nearly still. He barely moved, and yet every thought seemed visible. His voice was soft, but it filled the room. One student would later say, "It felt like watching someone think out loud." Jean put her pen down. The rest of the class went quiet, not polite quiet, actual quiet. When he finished, no one clapped, no one moved. Jean stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Do that again." Had you been in that room, would you have recognized what you were seeing? Or would it have just looked strange? 6 months earlier, James Dean had left UCLA. He'd enrolled as a theater major in 1948, full of hope and raw hunger. But his instructors found him difficult, too internal, too strange. One professor told him he didn't have leading man material, that he was too intense, too odd-looking, too Midwestern. He left after one semester. It wasn't the first time someone had made him feel like he didn't fit. His mother had died when he was 9 years old. His father, unable to cope, sent him to live with an aunt and uncle on a farm in Fairmount, Indiana. Jimmy grew up feeling like an exile, like someone whose presence was tolerated but not chosen. Acting was the first place he'd ever felt like himself. Not performing for approval, performing because it was the only language that made sense. The only way he knew how to translate what he carried inside, grief, longing, confusion, rage, into something that could be witnessed. But no one had validated it yet. No one had told him that what he was doing was real. He didn't care about fame. Not yet. He cared about knowing whether the thing he felt had substance, or if he was just broken in a way that looked like art. Jean Owen represented something more than authority. She represented clarity. If she saw it, really saw it, then maybe it existed outside his own head. That's why he came back the second time she asked. He performed the piece again. Different this time. Same emotional core, but nothing was mechanical. He wasn't repeating, he was reliving. Jean watched in silence. Then she stopped him halfway through. "Where did you train?" "Nowhere," he said. She frowned. "You're lying." "I'm not." "Then you're stealing this from someone." "I'm not." She stared at him. He stared back. His face didn't change, but something in his posture said, "Believe me or don't. I can't make you." Jean stood, looked at the rest of the class. "Take a break," she said. 10 minutes. The students shuffled out, murmuring to each other. Jean gestured for Jimmy to follow her into the hallway outside the auditorium. The corridor was dim, lined with old theater posters under cracked glass. She crossed her arms. "Are you serious about this?" she asked. "Or are you just trying it out?" Jimmy didn't answer right away. He looked down at the tile floor, then back up at her. "I don't know the difference yet," he said. Jean studied him, not with suspicion, with something closer to recognition. She'd spent years watching people pretend. This kid wasn't pretending. He was confessing. If you want to hear stories about the early years, the ones that shaped the legend before the camera ever turned on, subscribe now. These are the moments that don't make it into the biopics. Jean Owen stood in that hallway for a long time, arms crossed, weighing something. She'd been teaching for 4 years. In that time, she'd seen students with technical skill, students with confidence, students with beauty or charm or the kind of face that photographed well under stage lights. She had never seen anyone perform the way this kid just had. Not once. "Come back tomorrow," she said finally. 4 o'clock, and bring something else." Jimmy nodded. "And register for the class," she added. "Officially, I don't work with ghosts." The next day, he did exactly what she asked. He came back at 4. He brought a different piece, something he said he'd written himself, though he wouldn't explain what it was about. It was short, uncomfortable. It had no clear beginning or ending. It felt like eavesdropping on someone's panic. Jean watched in silence. When he finished, she asked him a question she rarely asked anyone. What are you afraid of? He looked at her. That I'm making it up, he said. Making what up? That any of this matters. Jean nodded slowly. Then she did something that would define the next year of his life. She led him into the class. Not as a regular student, as something more. She gave him keys. To the theater, to the prop room, to the rehearsal studio in the basement that smelled like mildew and old costumes. She told him he could use the space after hours, whenever he needed to work something out. She didn't do this for everyone. She didn't do it for anyone. But she did it for him. You're going to do this whether I help you or not, she said. So I'd rather help you. Jimmy took the keys. He didn't say thank you. He just looked at her like she'd handed him something fragile. The other students noticed immediately. They complained, quietly at first, then louder. Why does he get special treatment? Why does she let him work alone? Why does he get to skip the exercises the rest of us have to do? Jean didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She just kept working with him. Stay with me here. Because what happened next is part of the reason James Dean never played it safe again. Jean started pulling him aside after class, not to critique his performances but to talk about what was underneath them, what he was trying to say, what he was avoiding. She treated him less like a student and more like a colleague, someone whose instincts were worth respecting, even when they didn't make sense yet. She introduced him to local directors, got him into student showcases at other colleges, let him observe her advanced scene study classes, even though he wasn't enrolled in them. She saw what he was, and she protected it. One afternoon in late October, after a rehearsal, she asked him why he never performed anything famous, why he always brought in strange, unpolished pieces that no one had heard of. He thought about it. Because I don't want to sound like anyone else, he said. Jean tilted her head. You don't. Good, he said. She smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile at him. Then stop apologizing for it. This wasn't a one-time thing. Jean Owen didn't just let James Dean into her class and move on. She became one of the most important figures in his early development, someone who gave him not just access, but belief. She let him use the theater after hours, sometimes until midnight. Other faculty members would walk past and see the lights on in the empty auditorium. They'd find Jimmy alone on stage, running the same scene over and over, changing a gesture, a breath, a single word. He was teaching himself specificity. Jean gave him books, Stanislavski, Adler, Chekhov. She didn't make him read them. She just left them on a chair in the rehearsal room with his name on a slip of paper. He read every one. By winter, he was performing in showcases off campus, small theaters in Los Angeles, experimental groups that met in warehouses and bookshops. Jean drove him to some of them, watched from the back, never told him what she thought until he asked. The other students grew resentful. They accused her of favoritism, of breaking her own rules. One student confronted her directly in the faculty lounge, said it wasn't fair that Jimmy got opportunities no one else did. Jean looked at him and said, "When you show me what he shows me, I'll give you the same." The student didn't bring it up again. Years later, long after Jimmy was gone, Jean wrote a letter to a biographer working on a book about Dean's early years. The letter is archived now at Indiana University. In it, she said something that explains everything. I have taught for 2 decades. I have seen raw talent, trained talent, and commercial appeal. James Dean was something else. He performed like someone trying to survive. That line, like someone trying to survive. Not impress, not succeed, survive. She understood that acting for him wasn't a career choice. It was a language for things he couldn't say any other way. And if no one had taken that seriously, if everyone had kept telling him he was too strange, too much, too different, he might have stopped trying to translate himself at all. Jean didn't teach him how to act. She taught him that what he already had inside was worth protecting. She gave him permission. And sometimes, that's all it takes to turn someone from invisible to unforgettable. Do you remember that folding chair, that scrape on linoleum, that moment of being called on when you're not expecting it? Sometimes your entire life changes because someone looked up from a clipboard. Not because they saw potential, because they saw you. By the summer of 1955, James Dean was famous. East of Eden had been released in March. Critics called his performance a revelation. Elia Kazan said he'd discovered something new. Warner Brothers offered him a 3-picture deal. Rebel Without a Cause was finished and waiting for release. He was 24 years old. The world had finally caught up to what Gene Owen saw in a community college auditorium 6 years earlier. But fame didn't erase memory, it sharpened it. In August of that year, 1 month before he died, Jimmy sat down and wrote Gene a letter. It was short, handwritten, mailed from Lowe's Angels on studio stationery that he'd crossed out at the top as if he didn't want the letterhead to speak for him. The letter still exists. Jean kept it in a desk drawer for the rest of her life. After she passed away in 1979, her sister donated it to the James Dean Gallery in Fairmont, Indiana. You can still see it there behind glass if you ask. In the letter, Jimmy thanked her. Not for teaching him how to act, not for giving him opportunities or opening doors. He thanked her for teaching him that what he had inside was worth protecting. He told her he still thought about that hallway, the keys, the quiet rehearsal space. He said he remembered the way she looked at him after that first performance, not impressed exactly, but interested, like she was trying to figure him out instead of dismiss him. He wrote, "You were the first person who didn't try to fix me." Jean never spoke publicly about the letter. When reporters asked her about James Dean after his death, she would only say that he'd been a serious student, that he worked harder than anyone she'd ever taught, that he was kind and strange and singular. She never used his name to elevate herself. She didn't need to. Because the truth is this: the public saw the rebel, the icon, the too fast life and the too soon ending. They saw the performance of James Dean. But the foundation was laid in ordinary rooms by people who had nothing to gain and everything to give. Gene Owen was one of those people. She didn't make him a star. She didn't discover him in the Hollywood sense of that word. She did something harder. She saw him when he was still becoming himself, and she told him that was enough. That mattered more than any camera ever would. Because fame can validate talent, but it can't create it, and it can't replace the moment when someone you respect looks at you and says, "This is real, keep going." Jimmy kept going. He kept going all the way to the end. And when the end came, sudden, violent, incomprehensible, Gene Owen went back to teaching. She didn't give interviews. She didn't attend the memorials or the tributes. She kept his letter in her desk and taught her classes the same way she always had. Looking for the quiet ones. The ones in the back row. The ones everyone else ignored. Jean Nelson Owen continued teaching at Santa Monica City College until 1967. She never marketed herself as the woman who discovered James Dean. She never wrote a memoir or sold her story. In the few interviews she gave, she would only say, "I didn't discover him, I just didn't ignore him." That difference matters. Because the world is full of talented people sitting in the third row, waiting to be called on. The question is whether anyone bothers to look up. Jean looked up. And because she did, a 19-year-old kid who thought he might be broken learned that he wasn't. He was just different. And different, when it's protected, when it's given space to grow, can become transcendent. James Dean died 30 days after he mailed that letter. Gene Owen lived another 24 years. She never taught anyone quite like him again. But she never stopped looking. Have you ever had a teacher, coach, or mentor who saw something in you before you saw it yourself? Someone who gave you permission to stop apologizing for who you were. Tell me about them in the comments. I read them. If this story meant something to you, if you want more like it, the hidden chapters, the early years, the people who shaped the legend before the world knew his name, subscribe now. This is where those stories live. The next story I want to tell you is about what James Dean did the night before his first screen test. It involves a diner, a pay phone, and a promise he never got to keep.